Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Richard Ovenden. I'm this librarian and head of Gardens, Libraries and Museums here in the University of Oxford, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to this event this evening. This is literally the time where I get to say, come to Jesus. And we're here a very auspicious week for the appreciation of the amazing writer Franz Kafka, because on Monday we marked the centenary of his death, and centered around that event, Oxford has been celebrating Kafka through a whole variety of means, most particularly an exhibition in the Bodleian Library, Kafka Making of an Icon, and one of the Fellows of Jesus, Katrin Cole, who's one of the lead curators on that show. I warmly invite you to go and look at the exhibition. We've also had an academic program, a cultural program, and a thing called Oxford Reads Kafka, where we have invited the whole university and city to read his Metamorphosis this week, including a public reading event in the Sheldonian Theatre, which only overran by an hour, but it was a remarkable thing. So why is all this happening in Oxford when Franz Kafka was born in Prague, at the time in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, of Jewish parents? He wrote his book in German, and yet Oxford is gone Kafka nuts. And that's because his archive has ended up in the Bodleian Library through an extraordinary circuitous route. But that fact of his archive resting in the stacks of the Bodleian Library on Broad Street has enabled this event to take place. And that is because Leah Tomkins, the author of the book we're here to discuss and think about and purchase, dare I say, later on, after you've had a glass of wine, it's been more than one glass, but you're not going to leave until you... is that Leah came as a visiting fellow to the Bodleian. We have a visiting fellows program, so Leah was a Sassoon visiting fellow and had the opportunity to look at the archive in up close and personal, and that for her was a kind of reunion with Franz. Leah had been an undergraduate at this college a little bit before then, and read classics and German joint honours here, and obviously read Kafka, and so had become sort of imbued with Kafka's literature and his ideas and the atmosphere of writing that his work conjures up. And that atmosphere, that aura, which I certainly imbued as a teenager, and that sort of sense of kind of angst and in the interior life being connected in strange ways to the exterior world, also was imbued by Leah. And so the ability for her to come back and look at the manuscripts has helped her, I think, come to complete the book project, which has taken a number of years, and we're now here at this kind of moment to celebrate and to think about and interact. And she's here, and for me, this has been a particularly interesting project to be involved with, because we have, during the Oxford Reads Kafka program, tried to get the university and the city to think of the text from a number of different disciplinary perspectives. So we've had one of the great scholars on disability, Rosemary Garland-Thompson, here giving talks about Kafka and disability. We've had Helen McShane, one of our leading vaccinologists, talk about Kafka as a sufferer of TB and the idea of infectious disease. We've had our wonderful Taylor Schwartz, professor of German, Karen Leader, talk about Kafka and humor and Kafka and race. And we've had we still have to come, Tim Coulson, Professor of Zoology in the Natural History Museum, with trays and trays of cockroaches talking about entomology and species. And now we have a new perspective, and that is leadership. And that's the title of Leah's book, Franz Kafka and the Truths of Leadership. And Leah is a particularly appropriate person to investigate and deeply think about that topic. And because she has been involved in leadership either as an academic or as a leader, as a practitioner of leadership throughout her career. She is currently Professor of Leadership and Organisation with academic affiliations here in Oxford, but also at Cranfield University and the University of the West of England. And before that, she was in both in business and in public life. So she worked for Accenture, KPMG, and the Cabinet Office. So she's incredibly well qualified to actually write this book and to talk to us about it this evening. And we are extremely fortunate to have as her interlocutor, ladies and gentlemen, Shelagh Fogarty, who is one of the country's most eminent journalists. Shelagh has had a long and distinguished career at the BBC. She's covered the American presidential elections. She's broadcast live from St. Peter's Square for the funeral of John Paul II. She covered the devastating tsunami from Thailand and numerous other momentous events in world history, which she's been there to tell us and to interpret and to lead us through. So, and she now currently presents a weekday afternoon show for LBC. So I'm going to hand over now to our incredibly eminent panel, and I would invite you all to join me in welcoming.
They were very nice words. Eminent journalist is a bit strong. I'm a very good chatter. I chat for a living, is what my mum and dad always said. They're very proud of it, but I chat for a living. Can I say, first of all, just in the interest of my good manners, not yours, I'm using my phone as a kind of prompt. I'm not watching TikTok videos, just to be clear. So, Leah.
Unless I really do bore you.
Unless, yeah. And feel free to watch if it all gets a bit Kafkaesque. Great to do this with you and for you, because you're a great friend. But my first question to you, when you asked me a year and a half ago if I would do this event, there or thereabouts, it's the same question really. Why leadership? Why Kafka? And why the relationship between the two?
Why? Yes, I do remember that was your first question. Why
so
Kafka and leadership?
For a living.
In fact, I think it wasn't why Kafka and leadership, it was why on earth Kafka and leadership. Yeah. So at least we're starting a little bit more softly with that today. Well, so why leadership, and why leadership through the prism of Kafka? We are storytelling creatures. We make sense of the world through the stories we tell, and that's how we create cultures, including organizational cultures, national cultures, etc. And some of our most primal stories are of the exercise of power of leaders. If we go back to ancient myths, an awful lot of them are to do with the question of how do we look to the people who are supposed to direct us, to guide us, to comfort us? Where are the tensions with that? And so if we take that leadership as a slightly different topic, it's not like other topics in business schools, it's not like technology or policy. Leadership is one of those areas which evoke emotion and imagination and projection. Some of the stuff,
personal, isn't it?
It's very personal.
As much as the skills they have.
And that's why we tell stories about them. And so if we want to understand the ebbs and flows of power, including how they sometimes work in ways that are counterintuitive and not as per the textbook, we would do worse than go to the best storytellers of our human history. And funnily enough, Franz Kafka is one of the most remarkable storytellers in our literary and cultural history.
People who know a lot about him perhaps might not go down this route, but people who know a little about him, which I would include myself in that group, might instantly think, if they hear Kafka, they think interest in the victim rather than interest in the powerful. Obviously, it's a relationship between the victim and the powerful, but is part of your reason for writing this book, or is one of your reasons for writing this book, to encourage people, and maybe for you to have done it as well, to see Kafka through a different lens?
Yes, very much so. I mean, when you hear the expression Kafkaesque, I think most people, what gets conjured up is the image of the victim or the underdog, particularly the underdog who's up against the system and destined to lose because the system is so almighty that none of us stand a chance. And that is the image that has been sort of encouraged by an awful lot of the way that Kafka was treated in the 20th century, including by a very famous film of The Trial. Orson Welles depicted sort of small guy, literally small, up against, you know, an unjust system of justice.
But we've seen it in the post office scandal, just to name one example.
Yes, exactly.
We've seen that very dynamic, haven't we?
Yes, exactly. And I didn't listen to every single part of the post office scandal, but I bet
Nobody
you at some
did.
point. But at some point, I bet you they used the expression Kafkaesque.
Yes, yeah.
And they tend to mean, yes, absolutely impenetrable system, and that, you know, the ordinary human being is the loser or the underdog. And that is I mean, I'm tempted to say that's a profound misunderstanding of Kafka. I think more generously, I'm going to say that's not the whole picture. Yeah. Because when Elias Canetti, the Nobel Prize winner, said that of all writers, Kafka was the greatest expert in power, that shouldn't have signalled that he was an expert in impotence. It should have signalled how much he understood how you wield power, not how you succumb to it. And so my book takes that as its starting point, that actually we look to Kafka because he understood how to exercise power, not just because in his own life, again, against the popular image of him as some, you know, lowly clerk, Kafka was a leader. He was a very significant policy maker, a leader of his institution and his sector at a time when it was incredibly unusual for Jews to be promoted into such high positions. And in fact, against the mythology of Kafka, during the First World War, Kafka was not exempted from military service because he was unfit. That fits the image, but because he was absolutely indispensable to a vital national institution. So the image we have as the Kafkaesque, as the tiny cockroach, is very misleading.
The machine, that machine needed him.
Yes, exactly.
And we'll talk a little later about political figures, global, perhaps national as well, that we'll be very familiar with. But you have said, both to me and in some of the blurb, can I say blurb in Jesus College, Oxford? I can, yeah. In some of the blurb about your book and why you wrote it, you have, and your experience having written it, is that it's influenced you as an individual and how you approach leadership, how you approach the work that you do. Now, most of us in this room, in our working lives, well, perhaps more than our working lives, but certainly in our working lives, we will have probably been led or exposed to leadership at some point. Maybe been in positions of leadership ourselves, and you've obviously given a great deal of thought to leadership in this. What do we, and I say we in the very general sense, what do we get wrong when we do leadership and think about leadership? Because lots of people, I think, imagine it is loud and very visible and controlling probably, but the best leadership, my guess, isn't that.
Well, I think one of the key messages from this book is that through Kafka's eyes, power is not always where or what we think it is. And therefore, I think the thing we get wrong with leadership most is that we assume that people have leadership just by virtue of being put in a leader position. And so we overestimate the power of those who occupy these CEOs or prime minister positions. And by the sort of flip side of it, we underestimate the power that the rest of us have to actually exercise some control over our lives. So if we look to those who hold senior leadership positions, the message from Kafka is do not assume that their experience isn't one of profound impotence. And in fact, I think that's one of the real lessons for business schools. We need to do a better job of preparing leaders who come to leadership development programs to be able to talk about the elephant in the room. And one of the elephants is that actually the experience of being a leader is often incredibly lonely, very frustrating, and you have far less power and control over events than the textbooks tell you.
Need it be lonely?
I think it becomes less lonely if we start calling out some of these elephants in the room, and if we find a way to talk about the experience of impotence. And I mean, I don't mean impotence as a sort of dramatic, total absence of power.
A sense of lack of power.
Yeah, I think the fact that power ebbs and flows, it isn't, all concentrated in one or two human beings and the rest of us have none of it. It ebbs and flows, and through Kafkan eyes, it ebbs and flows through the movement of language, which is why the principle that I talk about in the book for power is that it is all to do with version control. And by that I mean that the people who have the greatest power in Kafka's texts are not necessarily the ones who've got justice or logic on their side, but they're the ones that win the battle to control the narrative, to get their truth recognized as definitive. And you can tell where I'm coming from here. This is where we move into the anxieties of our post-truth world, where facts are counterbalanced by alternative facts, where truth is up against post-truth. And Kafka offers us an absolute masterclass in how those dynamics unfold, how even the most blatant of lies can take on more power than the most demonstrable of truths.
And that isn't anything new. I mean, we've seen a heck of a lot of it in our politics in the last decade, for the sake of argument. But it's not new, is it? It has different incarnations, and the internet and social media has clearly put a rocket launcher under it in our age, but it's not new, is it?
No, it isn't new, and it wasn't new in Kafka's day, but he managed to put a shape and a language, including a language of imagination, around the very dynamics that we're now struggling with. I mean, I think what is new is newish is quite how blatant it is. I mean, this year, 2024, not just the centenary of Kafka's death, I think I read somewhere that over half the world's population are going through elections of some sort this year. And election after election after election, all the commentators, we're all steeling ourselves for the fact that leaders don't even have to pretend that they're telling the truth.
I've been on the receiving end of that myself. I mean, the weeks following, or was it months, I can't remember now, following the revelations of Partygate, I saw vividly what you've just described from very senior politicians sitting as close as you are to me in interviews. People who had told me on a Tuesday that blue was blue, told me on a Wednesday that blue was green, and just looked at me when I said, but you told me yesterday it was blue. And they just smiled at me. They didn't even counter it, apologize, fix it. They just smiled at me because they knew that most people wouldn't care, or they assumed most people wouldn't care.
And Kafka would have smiled at you too. One of the things that is very poorly understood about him was how incredibly funny his texts are. But he doesn't just alert us to the fact that there are these multiple truths and these multiple versions at work. He also, by the way he experiments with text and with language and with words and with grammar, he alerts us to how these things are constructed. And once you look at the conversations that you've had with these politicians who are saying white and black, lying, if you look at those through Kafkan eyes, he provides, as I say, a masterclass in precisely how those techniques work. And so they won't automatically stop the politicians lying to you.
Are there footnotes about how to deal with it? I've spotted Armando Iannucci here. Do you have footnotes on how to deal with it? Maybe we'll talk about that a bit later, because it's very much an area you've looked into in a dramatic sense, isn't it?
Well, one of the greatest compliments from my early readers, and my early reader who is here, greatest compliment I got from Alex when she first read the book was that she was afraid that spin doctors would take it as a manual. And it's not intended to be a manual for spin doctors, but I was very, very chuffed with the compliment.
Do you think he and your book, obviously, I mean, I'm not going to leave that out of the conversation, he and your book about him and leadership and power is very much important now, certainly for people like me, for lots of people in the information sphere, one way or another, or for anyone who cares about the truth, I guess.
And Kafka's I mean, I'm often asked, what is the nub of Kafka, which is obviously an impossible question. But if I had to say what is the nub, what was his main concern, it was truth. And I'm having to try and train myself not to use the definite article. I'm trying to say not the truth, because Kafka does alert himself and us to the various different facets or shades of truth. It isn't just about a fact, but it also, there's much more to his take on truth than the absence or the opposite of a lie. There are all sorts of truths. And leadership, in a way, has known that all along.
What do you mean when you say there are, and what did he mean when he said there are all sorts of truths?
Well,
because there are dangers in that, aren't there, in that statement?
Huge dangers. And that's a danger that is not unique to Kafka's take on leadership, because leaders, like all good storytellers, have always stretched the bounds of what can be said in the service of a good narrative. That's the vision thing. What is a vision is a story, it's a narrative. And we've always allowed leaders a certain amount of poetic license.
The fly.
The fly, yes.
And also, I mean, I wonder whether at some level, hopefully not too deep a level, we all do it a little bit in our lives. We choose how we. Some people I see a lot of people in my line of work very much curating themselves professionally.
Curating themselves,
you know what I mean?
yes.
And that's about telling a particular version of yourself, isn't it?
Yes, and in the book, I mean, there is a strong thrust around critique. I am critical of leaders. I hope, constructively so, but I'm critical of the ways in which they often distort the truth using these Kafkan techniques. But they don't have to be used for bad purposes. A lot of what Kafka does, particularly in his use of ambiguity, for example, ambiguity can be used for, sort of populist leaders, like some of the ones who will be on television tonight. Populist leaders in particular have a field day with ambiguity because they can stretch their message to mean almost whatever. But if we think about good, positive human relationships, particularly within sort of diplomatic settings, ambiguity can also be used to keep sources of conflict from ruining a conversation. So a lot of these techniques and tactics that Kafka's texts embody can be used for either good or ill.
Do you know which phrase is swirling around my head as you say this? You'll all know who said it, or who purported to say it. Recollections may vary.
Yes.
That's an ambiguous.
Yes.
It isn't, but yeah, it came straight to my mind as you said
Recollections do always vary with Kafka, and therefore what becomes interesting is which of the recollections win the force of a truth. And that's from the very beginning of his writing career. So his breakout work was The Judgment, which he wrote in the course of a single night, complete immersion in the writing. And it's an absurd tale, it's a short story, and the main characters all shape-shift dramatically over the course of the story. But it culminates in an allegedly successful businessman being sentenced to death by drowning by his father in a grubby nightshirt. And for 100 years, readers have been debating what on earth has the protagonist done? What is he guilty of? And actually, that's from that very first story, that's not the most interesting question with the dynamics of power. The question is not what has he done wrong, but why and how he allows his father to pronounce that sentence on him. And the same can be said of arguably Kafka's most famous work, The Trial, where, as most people will probably be familiar with the trial, where again a successful businessman is arrested one morning for reasons that are never spelt out, and a year later, after various toings and froings with the court authorities, is taken to the outskirts of the city and executed and dies like a dog. And so many different interpretations have been made of that story, and so many explanations for the nature of Joseph K's guilt. But actually, if we suspend the need to find out what he is guilty of and look at the dynamics through which he allows the court to pronounce that sentence, we get a sense of what the true Kafkan dynamic of power is. Because, as Joseph K himself says, this is only a trial if I recognize it as such. And that means, if you extrapolate it, you are only my leader if I recognize the version of events on which you're making your charge. And that has profound relevance for our interpersonal relationships as well, not least I think, in the concept of gaslighting, which is, one of those words that a lot of people use, where one can be made to feel guilty even if one's technically done nothing wrong.
Or feel forced to believe something.
Exactly,
Yeah.
one can allow oneself. And actually, the answer to gaslighting, particularly to those of us, myself included, who are a bit vulnerable to being gaslit, seriously guys, don't be Joseph K. So there's a lesson there on how not to be.
And we'll talk about political figures now, but just before we do, I think as well as in that interpersonal relationship sphere, there's also that statement of this is only a trial if I accept that it is. That was very alive in lots of the civil rights and human rights battles of the 20th century.
Yes.
And clearly ongoing in all, various parts of the world now. It's an important...
Yes.
It's very Mandela-esque, isn't it? It's an important baseline for having the dignity to fight somebody powerful or an oppressor of some sort.
The dignity to fight, but also the awareness that one's entering a fray where different versions are at work and you might not necessarily win.
But you've got to bring a version.
Yeah. And that makes me really think, not only does Kafka anticipate, I know I'm going to say Kafka anticipates, he doesn't anticipate everything, but he anticipates a lot. Not only does he anticipate post-truth dynamics, he also anticipates identity politics, because the battle between your truth and my truth that we're seeing unfold in really quite vibrant and often vicious ways, an awful lot of those ebbs and flows can be seen in Kafka's work.
So, I can think of, I've been thinking about them all the whole time you've been speaking, various world leaders, domestic leaders, you can call them that. But Zelensky is somebody you're very keen to talk about before we've broadened it out. Why is that?
There are a lot of leaders who are worthy of analysis through a Kafkan prism, and some of them will probably be quite triggering, I hope. But Zelensky is a fantastically Kafkan figure. And also highlights why it's very important for leadership commentators to critique leaders we admire as well as those that we don't, because it's very easy just to trash them. Zelensky is one of the things that Kafka does. One of his favourite games, which I have theorised as the Kafkan slip, which is different from the Freudian slip. So the Freudian slip is something which is probably a mistake, but implies that somehow the truth will out. The Kafkan slip, there's no chance of the truth coming out. The Kafkan slip initiates a whole load of truths and versions that are going to carry on haunting the story. So Kafka doesn't let you have any sense of the truth that Freud suggests. And the way that Kafka often does that is by transposing tiny, tiny, tiny things in words, usually one or two letters different, to be able to initiate completely different plot lines. And the most obvious and dramatic example of that is in The Castle, which is Kafka's final novel, where another K arrives one night in a snowbound village, to the village dominated by the castle of Count West, and claims to be the land surveyor appointed by the authorities. And for 100 years, people have been debating what is the significance of the profession of land surveyor, and lots and lots of answers put forward. But one of the most fabulous things about the words he chooses is he plays with the almost identical words for land surveyor and Messiah, Mashoa, Mashaya, one letter difference. And thereby he sets in motion the very possibility that runs all the way through the story, that actually when the villagers think they're talking to the land surveyor, and when the readers think they're dealing with a land surveyor, they could be dealing with the Messiah, with all of those. And so the Kafkan slip often is one or two letters that just create several concurrent plots that are never resolved. And one of the reasons I think Zelensky is such a superb Kafkan figure is to do with the dynamism of the Ukrainian language and the the fact that his name can be spelt many different ways, often with just the change of 1 or 2 letters. So unlike, and his name, but also other Ukrainian words such as Kiev. Remember when the Russians first invented, we all listened to all the BBC reporters struggling with Kiev, just 1 letter difference between them. And whereas you could never accidentally spell, for example, Leningrad as St. Petersburg, you could accidentally, Kafkan slip style, spell Kiev as Kiev.
And in the, I know this as a broadcaster, in the saying of it, you know, either deliberately or accidentally, and it would be accidentally in my case if I switch the two, you send a very different message,
yes.
don't you?
Yes.
Once people more widely know
yes.
why Ukrainians want Kyiv,
yes.
and you know,
yes.
then there's power.
Very different narratives of nationhood depending on which one you choose. And although the Ukrainian war is clearly being fought in a very terribly real, so just because I say battle takes place with language, I'm not for 1 second denying,
minimizing,
you know, actual weapons. But if you look at the battle of words between the Kremlin and Zelensky's leadership team, it's also being fought on the battle of language, because the Kremlin propagandists are making an enormous deal of the fact that, oh, we can't even spell Zelensky's word, and how can he possibly be a Jew because he's also anti-Semitic? They make an awful lot of the unreliability of the Zelensky persona. And in exchange, on Zelensky's part, by the way, Zelensky reminds me a lot of Kafka, also trained as a lawyer, so very, very agile with language. Zelensky, whose mother tongue is Russian, has started stumbling in public over Russian words, as if to just go, you know, just challenge the authority of the edicts.
Not to suggest this isn't my mother tongue, no?
I don't think he's suggesting it's not my mother tongue. I think he's suggesting it's not all powerful, because look, we stumble it. He started to say, oh, how do you say that? And just by introducing that note of hesitation, it highlights that the words of the Kremlin aren't almighty.
I don't know how much people saw of Zelensky at the Normandy services yesterday. Obviously, everybody saw Sunak fleetingly at the Normandy services yesterday. But his presence there, I thought, was interesting. The clothes he was wearing, the way he was greeted by that elderly veteran, and how he responded to him, and how the uber powerful people like Biden, you know, responded to Zelensky as well. I mean, and again, that's all very much for public consumption, isn't it?
Yes.
What goes on behind the scenes is a whole different.
Yeah, Zelensky is a very, very skilled leader. I mean, I think his dress, his attire since the invasion speaks volumes, because he manages to pull off that trick that every leader would like to and very few do, which is appealing both to the sense that he's one of us and that he's some singular different figure.
Yeah.
So both that he's a hero and that he's a man of the people, because his sort of quasi-military attire, you know, it's not an army uniform, you know, so but it is army green. So yes, it signals that Ukraine is under such ferocious attack that we absolutely need all the military power we can muster. But it symbolizes something more than that. It symbolizes that actually nothing short of the mobilization of the entire Ukrainian population is going to be enough. You know, he's simultaneously this singular hero. Many other of the world's leaders have been mocked by trying to emulate him by dressing similarly, but at the very same time he's kind of feisty guerrilla, one of the people. And so very, very interesting, the messages it sends.
Yeah, and he also has that story of having stayed when he was given a chance to leave.
Yes.
And if that's not narrative and power, I don't know what is really.
Yes, yes. He's one of the, he manages to understand the myths of leadership, and one of the most central and original, going back millennia, myths of leadership is that leaders must show that they care, that they are concerned and they will protect us. And the best way of showing you don't care is not to be around, is to bolt it the first sign of trouble. And people who may have read my work have known that I've been very critical of Mr. Boris Johnson for not being around, for example, in the early days of the COVID pandemic, because that signaled, that sent a message of not caring.
And then not really join the party.
And then yes, before we even got ambushed by cake, there were some messages there. But Zelensky absolutely gets what Johnson didn't, which is you have to show that you are there to contain our anxieties, to be there with us.
And I want to talk more about some particular political leaders in a moment, but Queen Elizabeth, the late now Queen Elizabeth, she did a lot of her, it seems to me, I mean, it'd be interesting to know whether you see any Kafka stuff in this. She did a lot of her, it's not so much power, is it? But it becomes power, a kind of soft power, through a kind of semaphore, didn't she? In a very limited, she had a very limited lane in a sense, and yet she seemed to use it with such effectiveness over the years. I mean, that ebbed and flowed, to use your term.
Yes.
But still.
That's. I don't think I'd ever imagine putting Queen Elizabeth and Kafka in the same sentence.
I just did it. I went there.
But
I'll tell you why it was in my mind is that during the pandemic, when Johnson gave that 23rd of March announcement that we'll all remember that he had to stay at home and all the rest of it, I was caring for my mother at the time in Liverpool, and we watched it together, and she turned to me, and she thought he was a clown, you know, and she turned to me and said, translate that for me. And I said, you've got me till August. And she said, okay, great, fine. And then some days later, but not that many days later, the Queen gave her televised address, didn't she? And we watched that together. And my mum just said, this is more like it. And I just thought that was really revealing, you know. It was this is more like it. And she just understood that somebody was saying, now my mother's an Irish woman, you know, so she could well handle it. But she needed somebody in a position of power, authority, leadership to say, it's going to be okay.
Yes, leadership is about so much more than, you know, the textbooks will tell you that it's about setting direction, setting strategy, but there's an awful lot in the symbolism and the provision of a safe space for us to project our hopes and fears. And I say that some of that goes back to very old myths and legends about all our figures of authority, including relationships with parents, etc. So these are old myths that get triggered and re-triggered when we have either satisfying or disappointing relationships with our leaders.
And just before I throw things out to people who want to ask questions themselves, which other world leaders leap out at you as connected to Kafka in some way in your mind?
It's almost impossible, and again I apologise if this is triggering, it's almost impossible not to look at the very notorious populist leaders through a Kafkan prism, because as soon as I talk about facts and alternative facts,
Trump,
of course it takes us into the Trump territory. But I also think that Boris Johnson, who is very, very agile with language, sometimes can be, he must have read his Kafka too. Because some of the tactics, and sometimes he gets away with them, some of the tactics that he deploys, including that he deployed as a journalist before you know, in that first or second career, some of the tactics he deploys are right out of the Kafka playbook, particularly in the manipulation of attention. Because with Kafka, and we have to remember Kafka was writing at a time when the newly emergent discipline of psychology was trying to map the processes of attention and cognition. Cinema was new, high-speed train travel was new, so attention and distraction were sort of hot topics in a way that now social media would be the equivalent for us. Yeah. And Kafka knew full well that one of the best ways to perplex his protagonists and his readers is to divert our and their attention from something that matters onto something that doesn't. And one of the ways and vice versa, and back again, because the best way to keep people confused, as Boris Johnson knows full well, is to make so many gaffes that you just befuddle your audience, and then you just sneak in when no one is looking and actually get the policy through that you want to. So Johnson is an expert on Kafka-esque distraction tactics, and again, that's another sentence I might not have imagined ever saying.
And Trump?
Yeah, well, Trump is at the extreme end, isn't he? Because actually he doesn't even pretend that truth matters. But one of the examples that has really stuck with me from the first Trump presidency, I hope
it's the last one, but yeah.
I'm sorry to the Americans in the audience, is in response to, I remember it was his press secretary, I think, Sarah Sanders, was it, who, in response to being caught out in what was, guys, a lie, I think there was a video that Trump had said showed some kind of Muslim violence, etc., and was subsequently proved to be a downright lie. The response from the Trump office was not, it doesn't matter that it was not factually true, because the overall sense of the threat was true. So if you can shift the criterion of evaluation from something that is literally true to something that is true in some other sense, that is a very, very powerful technique of manipulation.
And he uses a lot.
And he uses it. And his office used that a lot as well.
He's good at it, yeah. I think Donna Latkin has a question about the political sphere. Donna, where are you? Ah, here she is. Hi.
Hi, Leah. Well, first of all, it's just lovely to hear you talk about the book. It's great, fantastic work, and you really bring those concepts from Kafka alive in a way that I think really means something to those of us involved in leadership scholarship, so thank you so much for that. But you've been talking about political leaders. So my question, there happens to be a general election in this country soon. I wonder what your analysis says about what's going on in the general election that's happening.
Yes, the general. When we first set the date for this, we didn't know that one of the country's leading political journalists would.
I'm genuinely not being falsely modest here. I'm really not one of those.
She's chosen Kafka over Rishi Sunak, which again is one of those sentences one might not have.
I've got great taste. Yeah.
I mean, general elections, election campaigns are ripe for analysis through a Kafkan prism, because they represent a very condensed, concentrated period of time. The clock is ticking, and we're all sort of waiting for when the first gaffe is going to be. Well, I think we've probably had them.
We've had a few, haven't we?
And I mean, one of the things to correct is a lot of people say, and I might have said this in the past, that the Kafkan world makes no sense. With Kafka, you're in a world that doesn't make any sense. I don't think that's true. Kafka's world does make sense. There are logics in the world, but it's just not the kind of sense that gives us comfort. So there are logics that we have to get our head around if we want to understand and even predict how things are going to happen. And one of the logics of the Kafkan world is, and this comes from his professional expertise. He was, as I say, an extremely skilled lawyer in insurance. In the days where statistical analyses were still relatively new as a mechanism of organizational control. And he understood full well that through a statistical prism, disasters have to happen, and because there is a distribution curve that says disasters are going to happen with this frequency. So in the Kafkan world, disasters are going to happen. The only uncertainty is who they're going to happen to, and who is going to be able to sidestep them. And therefore, actually, that has come to light in the last 24 hours, when we knew there would be a disaster. We knew there would be probably several disasters in an election campaign, and the only uncertainty was who it was going to happen to first. And I think today's example is that. The other thing that occurs to me in terms of who is going to sidestep the banana skins and who isn't, goes back to the idea of the Kafkan slip, the change of one or two letters that actually sets completely different plots in motion. And I mean, there are an awful lot of opportunities for the Kafkan slips in some of our political figures.
Well, I think the tax claim / lie was such an example, wasn't it? Yes. And within 2 days, less than, the Statistics Authority regulator has said the way you presented that information was actively misleading, and people could not possibly, most people couldn't possibly have understood or known that it was over a 5-year period, and would have assumed you were going to tax them $2,500 a year more. And that's true. Most of the callers to my programme thought it was a year, and I kept repeating the truth. But well, actually, is it the truth? We don't know, do we? I've got the truth of the figure anyway, the truth of the claim, and then sure enough, within another 24 hours,
we get a different version.
And but I mean, in a way, the Sunak blunder, and it was a political blunder, but it was also a human mistake, wasn't it? It was bad conduct, it was poor conduct towards those veterans. And I've seen people today try to extend it beyond that event itself. And I think that's exactly what you're describing. Change the narrative, shift the narrative.
Yes.
But to me, it is, and to lots of people I spoke to about it, it is strictly about those men and women, that event, that mistake. But it has so many political implications as well, doesn't it?
The banana slips are, the banana skins are there waiting for them to fall over. And through Kafkan eyes, the people who are most likely to slip over those banana skins are the ones whose name can be changed by a single letter. Because I meant, Mashoa, Messiah, Land Surveyor, Messiah. And therefore, my Kafkan antennae are up at the moment on whose names can be altered and distorted by a single letter. And obviously, Rishi Sunak, as many others have highlighted, unfortunate name to be so close to Rich. So there's there's a Kafkan
Richie
slip
Sunak,
waiting there to happen. But the most perfect Kafkan slip that I think when I only thought about this the other day actually, was, and again I'm sorry if this is triggering, because she has played an interesting role in our life recently.
This is Liz Truss.
Liz Truss. Because one of the things which is an almost perfect encapsulation of the Kafkan slip, because the Kafkan slip, and say it's several strands, several plots can happen, is that when she first came to office, it was hilarious for those of us on social media, not that I spend that much time, the fact that there was an @Liz Truss and an @Truss Liz. And there were, for many days, if not even a couple of weeks, there were quite a lot of foreign governments and foreign organisations and quite significant institutions who assumed that our new Prime Minister was @Liz Truss. And @Liz Truss was actually played along with the game for quite a long time.
And was it a comedy account?
Well, it was a real account. She just happened to be, I think her name was Liz Trussell or something. But she was getting all of this correspondence directed towards our Prime Minister, and she played along with it.
It happened to a man called John Lewis as well, didn't it? When the Christmas ad came out.
Yes,
2 years back,
exactly.
You had to make clear.
Exactly.
And I know that Alexandra Bristow wanted to ask about, how all of your reading and interpretation of Kafka and leadership together has impacted on, because I know you've been a leader in many incarnations. Has it, well, ask your own question. I'm being terrible. You do it.
I think it's a fascinating discussion. Thank you for bringing it to life. As you know, Leah, your book has blown my mind in the best possible way. And I'm already thinking about leadership differently and about Kafka differently. Because, in popular opinion, Kafka is often associated with despair, and you made me think about him in terms of hope. And obviously there are lots of lessons and possibilities opening up from that. So I just wanted to turn the spotlight back on you, and could you tell us a bit more about the lessons that you personally draw from Kafka for your work, your practice, your future, maybe what's next for you in Kafka as well? I want to know.
Well, like Richard, I think what's next for us both in Kafka is a break from Kafka after the centenary event. I mean, I think I'd answer that in two ways. Number one, I really do practice what I preach, in the sense that we should stop thinking of leadership as only what happens over there, only what happens in organisations, we all exercise leadership, and we are all led in all areas of our lives, and therefore the lessons of what works well, what feels good, what feels less good, we can apply very personally. But a more personal answer to that, and it's funny you mentioned the word hope, I have been reflecting a lot during the time of writing this book on how important it is, well, how easy it is for those of us who write about leadership, whether we're scholars or journalists or commentators. An awful lot of people in this room, we are social commentators. We say something about the world, often about the world when it disappoints us. And an awful lot of that, we write from a place of anger. I know I do. I write, some of my excoriating on leadership have been written from a place of anger. And this book hasn't been. This book has been written from a place of love. And I think and I hope that, I don't think that dulls my critique, because I think I'm probably as spiky, you'll be the judge when you read it. But I think what that gives you is an ability, yes, for hope. Because if you write from a place of love, you can criticize and you can offer critique and you can reflect, but you can do it from a position of wanting things to be better. And so I've learnt with this book that it's a much more rewarding experience to write from love than from anger.
I think it also, to write, it's a really lovely distinction you make, because I think the latter, to investigate something with love and from love, it doesn't mean your critical faculties go away, but hopefully it means that the very man and his writing that you want to elucidate in a new way can come through, and you wouldn't be so, I don't think any of us would be so searching if it was all about loathing, would we? You know, you couldn't sit in that. I couldn't sit in that for long hours. So yeah, I think that's a lovely way.
Well,
lovely
the
distinction.
Great Kafka scholar Stanley Korngold, and I say that not just because he wrote very lovely things for the back cover of my book, but that did help.
Which we'll all be reading later when we buy the book. Yeah.
The very wonderful Kafka scholar Stanley Korngold says that to write about Kafka in new contexts is to give him renewed power. And that for me has been a wonderful, wonderful mantra for this book, because it allows me to show and develop my incredible appreciation for him.
And hopefully the reader gets that experience too. We'll finish soon because there's wine upstairs, there are books to buy upstairs, there's a huge discount on the books. They were initially, shall I say the prices?
No.
Because I'm bad at percentages. It's an extremely good discount, let me tell you. So you buy one before your first wine and buy another one after your second wine. I think that's the plan. But any sort of thoughts, questions that the audience has? Anybody in the audience, just raise your hand or throw it out there. Don't be shy.
And we'll be up for chatting upstairs as well. But yeah.
I have to confess, I'm an ignoramus about Kafka. Sorry. But what I want to know is, you talked about how a good reader creates a space, a safe space for our hopes and dreams. What does Kafka tell us about that?
One of Kafka's most remarkable techniques is the use of ambiguity, the very skillful use of ambiguity, which is partly why so many people have interpreted him in different ways. Because if the text only had one meaning, then you know it would be simple. It would be a scientific text or a shopping list or so. He's well known for being readable from very different perspectives, and that is a hugely important space for the relationship with the reader. Because if you allow space for the reader to project their own hopes and dreams and their own imagination and their own intuition, then the reader becomes personally connected with Kafka. And you can tell even by the way I'm sitting forward, this goes to the heart of Kafka, because he, unlike any other artist that I can think of, what he manages to do is to create an incredibly personal and intense relationship between author and reader, as well as implying a universal relevance. And the only way I can find to describe that, and I know other Kafka scholars experience the same, because when you find a way to talk about it, it comes out, is that I have a very jealous connection with Kafka. Kafka belongs to me, and others also feel the same, and yet at the very same time, I absolutely recognize and admire his universality. And that's not by accident. He does that, amongst other things, by the creation of the space in which each reader individually sees themselves a little bit projected in the stories he paints. So he creates this, in the book I talk about this paradox of jealousy, he's mine, and generosity. He says something to all of us.
Yeah.
You have mentioned, I was thinking when you start talking about crisis. In a crisis, how the leader, particularly these days, I'm talking about authority. When you have the crisis, you have to have the authority. And if you don't have the authority, sometimes I'm thinking,
Yeah, I mean, crisis conditions of all sorts legitimize a certain sort of leadership, because in a crisis, the models of leadership that rise to the top and that we demand are the more directive. You know, in a crisis, we want someone to step up and take charge. And that satisfies some of our needs, but it is also the space where we can be easily distracted and distorted, and to sort of take our eye off the ball in some senses, you know, permit things that we wouldn't normally permit. Crisis conditions sort of give leaders sort of a certain authority and permission they might not always have.
Well, COVID is the most recent terrain for that to be played out, isn't it, in some ways? Does anyone have any? Yep, there's a question about that.
You stress that Kafka's words are very important. He uses them very carefully and in a specific way. I know you looked at Kafka's manuscripts at the Bodley Library. I wanted to ask whether, looking at the words, he may have changed or restructured certain phrases. Was it helpful to your theories, or was it not? What can you tell us about that aspect of his own writing?
It was, and by the way, this is the woman who is charged with the safekeeping of the Kafka manuscripts.
Oh, wow.
So thank you on behalf of the world for that. Yes, hugely. I mean, when I first had access to the Kafka manuscripts, I didn't quite know what I would find, but both the book as a whole and specifically my chapter 8, which is all about the language of leadership, could not have been written without seeing those manuscripts at close quarters, because I undertook a very detailed, very fine-grained analysis of the words, the crossings out, the pentimenti, where he places his chapter breaks. He does extraordinary things with the disruption of meaning and the creation of new meaning. You know, when we're talking about the versions, which version is going to win out, he, at a very micro level, he experiments with those manipulations of texts. And yes, my chapter 8 of the book is my Bodleian chapter, and it hugely reminded me of his relevance for leadership and any profession that relies on the manipulation of words, and where you put closure, where you leave space. I'm glad we're not playing with it, but you know, we could have been much nastier to each other about where we put the closure markers. Next time you see a facsimile of the Kafka text, look at where he puts the closure markers, because closure, for example, creates a sense of the world as episodic, whereas one of the things Kafka wants to do is highlight that actually these episodes aren't natural. We can create the episodes where we want to. We can create the versions where we want to, and thereby exercise power.
Well, not even time is episodic, we have learned, so that's a whole other evening. But listen, it's been so great to have you all here, and it's been wonderful to share this with you, Leah. Thank you. Congratulations on the book.
Thank you.
You can get a book, buy a copy upstairs. You can also you get with it a free, beautiful tote bag with that on the front, so you can leave the building looking very clever indeed, which I'm sure you all don't need any help with at all. Thank you very much indeed, and let's congratulate Leah on the book. Thank you.